73 seconds. That is how long the Challenger flew before it turned into a fireball. But what happened after? That is the part they don't teach you in school. The search for the wreckage was the largest maritime salvage in history, but it was full of strange occurrences.
The first clue came when they cleared the sand, heat tiles, the same protective tiles that once covered the bottom of the country's space shuttles.
Divers reported odd equipment failures. Sonar ghosts appeared and vanished. Then came the big one, a contact on the radar that was solid, heavy, and deep. It was the crew cabin, but when they brought it up, the evidence inside didn't match the official story of a painless end. The switches were flipped, the air was used, and the timeline of the disaster was about to be rewritten. The phantom on the sonar. The Atlantic Ocean is a massive, indifferent beast. It swallows ships, planes, and secrets without leaving a trace. In the winter of 1986, it had swallowed the pride of the American space program. The search for the Challenger was not just a recovery mission, it was a desperate hunt for answers in a hostile environment. The surface search was chaotic, with thousands of pounds of white debris floating on the waves, but the real target was deep below. The Navy had deployed a fleet of ships, submarines, and research vessels to scan the ocean floor. The search grid was enormous, covering nearly 500 square miles of shifting sand and deep currents. It was like trying to find a specific car parked in a parking lot the size of a state, except the lights are off and the parking lot is underwater. For weeks, the sonar operators stared at their screens until their eyes burned. They were looking for contacts, any irregularity on the smooth bottom of the ocean. Most of the time, it was nothing. A sunken refrigerator, an old oil drum, a rock formation that looked like a wing. The ocean is full of junk, and every false alarm drained the energy of the crew. But here's the catch. The waters off Cape Canaveral were not empty. This was the height of the Cold War. While the Americans were searching for their lost shuttle, the Soviets were watching. There were reports of Russian fishing trawlers sitting just outside the exclusion zone. These weren't just fishermen, they were intelligence ships, bristling with antennas, listening to every radio frequency and watching the recovery efforts. The paranoia was real. The U.S. Navy had to divert resources just to keep an eye on the Russians. There was a genuine fear that if the Soviets got to the wreckage first, they could steal classified technology or, even worse, plant false evidence. The divers weren't just fighting the elements, they were working in the shadow of a potential international incident. And that's putting it lightly. Then, in early March, the rhythm of the search broke. The USS Preserver, a rescue and salvage ship, was running a side-scan sonar line in a sector that had been marked as low probability. The operator on duty was watching the waterfall display, a scrolling image of the seafloor built by sound waves. Suddenly, a signature appeared that made him sit up straight. It wasn't the jagged, scattered return of a debris field. Usually, when an aircraft hits the water at high speed, it shreds into confetti. The pieces are small and spread out over miles. But this signal was different. It was a hard, solid return. It had sharp edges. It had geometry. Nature does not make right angles, and it definitely doesn't create large, boxy structures in the middle of a sand plain. The operator called the bridge. "Mark this contact," he said. The ship circled back, running the sonar over the spot again from a different angle. The image sharpened. It was a large object sitting heavily in the silt, partially covered but unmistakably artificial. It was roughly 30 feet long. The room went quiet. The dimensions didn't match the wings. It didn't match the tail. It didn't match the cargo bay doors. There was only one part of the shuttle that was that size and that shape. The crew knew what it was before anyone said it out loud. It was the crew compartment. But there was something disturbing about the signature. It was too intact. The shuttle had been torn apart by aerodynamic forces at 46,000 feet. Everyone had assumed the destruction was total. The popular belief was that the vehicle had been vaporized. But the shadow on the screen told a different story. It suggested that a massive piece of the ship had survived the fireball and the fall. And if the compartment was intact, that meant the astronauts might have been inside it when it hit the water. The mood on the ship shifted from a technical search to a somber, terrifying realization. The commander ordered the divers to suit up. This wasn't going to be a standard salvage dive. This was going to be a descent into a tomb. The water conditions were rough, the visibility was near zero, and the psychological weight of what they were about to find was pressing down on them. As the divers prepared to jump, the sonar continued to ping off the object below. It was a steady, rhythmic sound like a heartbeat in the dark. But the ocean had one more surprise waiting. As they refined the coordinates, they noticed other faint signals nearby. Debris or something else? Rumors began to circulate among the crew. Some whispered about a second object that didn't belong to the shuttle. Others talked about strange interference on the comms channels during the scan. Was it the Russians jamming them? Was it a glitch? Or was the disturbing signature pointing to something far more complicated than a simple crash site? The divers splashed into the water, following the guideline into the abyss, unaware that the object waiting for them would challenge the official story of how the 7 astronauts actually died. Flash and the freeze. To really understand the horror of what the divers were about to find, we have to rewind the clock. We have to go back to the morning of January 28th. The official story is that a rubber seal failed because it was cold. That is the version in the history books. But it's not that simple. On the morning of the launch, Florida was experiencing a freak weather event. The temperatures had plunged deep into the 20s. The launch pad, usually a place of heat and steam, looked like an ice fortress. Massive icicles, some nearly a foot long, were hanging from the service structure. The safety team was worried that the ice would break off during liftoff and damage the tiles. But the real danger was invisible. Inside the massive white solid rocket boosters, the rubber O-rings that were supposed to seal the joints had turned into hard plastic. They had lost their ability to flex. Morton Thiokol, the company that built the boosters, knew this. Their engineers were frantic. They held a teleconference with NASA the night before, begging them to delay. They said, "Do not launch." NASA was under immense pressure. The program was behind schedule. They were trying to prove that space travel could be like an airline, reliable, punctual, and routine. They had a teacher on board, Krista McAuliffe, and they wanted her lesson to be broadcast during the school day. The political optics of a delay were bad, so the concerns were brushed aside. The managers basically told the engineers to take off their engineering hats and put on their management hats. The launch proceeded. At T-0, the rockets ignited. The shuttle lifted off. It looked majestic, but hidden in the smoke, a tragedy was already unfolding. In less than a second, a puff of black smoke appeared at the aft field joint of the right booster. The seal had failed. But then it seemed to seal itself again. Aluminum oxide from the burning fuel plugged the gap. For a minute, it looked like they were going to make it. Then the shuttle encountered the wind shear. It was the strongest wind shear ever recorded for a shuttle launch. The vehicle was buffeted by high-altitude gusts. The vibration broke the temporary seal. A jet of flame, like a blowtorch, escaped from the side of the booster. It burned through the strut, holding the booster to the tank. Here is where the theories start to get wild. Reviewing the footage later, some people claimed they saw a flash or an anomaly near the tank before the explosion that didn't look like fire. conspiracy theorists jumped on this. They claimed it was a laser strike. Why would anyone laser the shuttle? The Cold War. The theory was that the Soviets used a space-based weapon or a submarine-based laser to sabotage the launch, ensuring the American Star Wars defense program would be crippled. Is it crazy? Yes. But in 1986, with nuclear tension at an all-time high, people believed anything was possible. There were rumors of a brown box, a mysterious electronic device that some claimed was attached to the external tank, sending strange signals. NASA denied it, of course, but let's stick to the facts, which are scary enough. The flame burned through the tank. The bottom of the tank fell out. The liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen mixed. Boom. But here's the thing that most people don't realize. It wasn't an explosion in the traditional sense. It was a rapid combustion, yes, but mostly it was an aerodynamic breakup. The shuttle didn't blow up like a bomb. It was torn apart by the wind because it was flying sideways at twice the speed of sound. This distinction is crucial. If it had been a high explosive detonation, everything would have been pulverized. But because it was a structural breakup, large pieces survived. The wings sheared off, the tail snapped, and the crew compartment, built to be the strongest part of the ship, ripped away from the cargo bay. The cabin was flying free. At that moment, the astronauts were still strapped in. The cockpit was hurtling upward, carried by momentum. It reached a peak altitude of about 65,000 feet before gravity grabbed it. Then it began to fall. This is the part that keeps engineers awake at night. The flash was seen by millions, but the survival of the cabin was a secret that was buried in the data for months. The video footage shows the nose section emerging from the fireball, intact, trailing a web of wires. So when the divers were looking at that sonar signature weeks later, they weren't looking at a piece of scrap metal. They were looking at a vessel that had flown a ballistic trajectory for 2 minutes and 45 seconds after the explosion. The mystery wasn't just about the mechanics of the failure, it was about the experience of the fall. Did they know? Were they awake? And why did the signature on the ocean floor look so deliberate? Some theorists even suggested that the shuttle was brought down by internal sabotage, a disgruntled employee, a compromised part. The wild theories range from the plausible, manufacturing defects hidden by corruption, to the insane. The crew was taken off before launch and the shuttle was empty. But the sonar signature was about to provide the hard, cold reality that would crush the wilder theories while confirming the darkest fears. The divers were now hovering over the site, and as their lights cut through the silt, they saw something that proved the wildest theory of all. The theory of survival was actually true. Shadow in the silt. The descent into the Atlantic is a journey into sensory deprivation. As the divers from the USS Preserver went deeper, the light from the surface faded into a dark, bruising blue and then to black. The only sound was the hiss of the regulator and the bubbles rattling past their ears. It is a lonely place. The depth was roughly 100 feet. Not deep enough to be the abyss, but deep enough to eliminate you if you made a mistake. The currents were strong, tugging at the divers' gear, trying to drag them away from the guideline. The silt on the bottom was fine and loose. One wrong fin kick could stir up a cloud that would reduce visibility to 0. When the lead diver's light finally hit the object, he froze. The sonar hadn't lied. It was a massive structure. It was sitting upright, banking slightly to one side in the sand. The white thermal tiles were scorched and missing in patches, revealing the aluminum skin underneath. Wires were floating around it like tentacles of some robotic sea creature. It was the forward fuselage. The cockpit. The windows were the most haunting part. The thick, reinforced glass was still there. Through the murky water, the divers could see into the flight deck. It wasn't empty. The seats were there, the control panels were there, and the crew. The report on the condition of the remains is classified, and out of respect, we won't go into graphic detail. But we can say this: the cabin had held together. It hadn't been crushed like a soda can. It had been flattened by the impact, deformed by the massive deceleration of hitting the water at 200 miles per hour, but it was still a recognizable room. This discovery sent a shockwave through the recovery team. Everyone had hoped in a grim way that the destruction had been total and instant. Finding the cabin largely intact meant that the forces in the air hadn't been enough to eliminate them. It meant the fall eliminated them. The divers had to work with extreme care. This was a grave sight, but it was also a crime scene. They couldn't just hook a chain to it and yank. They had to document everything. Where were the switches? What condition were the helmets in? Here is where the wild theories get some fuel. There were rumors among the salvage crews that the cabin wasn't found where it should have been. The currents in that area are strong, but the heavy cabin shouldn't have drifted that far. Some speculated that the cabin had flown further than the aerodynamics predicted, suggesting the pilots had control for a few seconds, trying to steer a brick. Another strange detail emerged. The divers found personal effects that seemed oddly placed. A flight checklist floating near a window, a helmet that wasn't locked into its ring. It created a scene of activity. And then there was the Soviet submarine theory again. During the recovery, there were unconfirmed reports of sonar contacts shadowing the U.S. Navy ships. The divers were constantly looking over their shoulders. Imagine being 100 feet underwater, working on a tomb, and worrying that a Russian mini-sub might be watching you from the gloom. It sounds like a movie plot, but the tension was real. The U.S. Navy actually dropped scare charges, small explosives, to warn off unidentified submersibles in the area. Why would the Soviets be interested? Because the shuttle was military-grade technology. The heat tiles, the computers, the engines, it was the crown jewel of American engineering. If the Russians could grab a piece of the wreckage, specifically a piece of the electronics or the encryption gear, it would be an intelligence goldmine. So the divers weren't just recovering bodies, they were racing against the clock and potential thieves. They worked in shifts 24 hours a day, bringing up pieces of the cabin. They used suction dredges to clear the sand. They used baskets to bring up the smaller debris. The psychological toll was immense. These were tough Navy divers, men who had seen everything, but surfacing from that dive changed them. They were quiet. They didn't joke in the mess hall. They had seen the faces of the national heroes, and they had seen the evidence that the end didn't happen the way the public thought. When the cabin was finally rigged for lifting, the weather turned bad. The sea became rough. The crane strained under the load. It was as if the ocean didn't want to let go. But slowly, the shattered remains of the Challenger's heart broke the surface. Water cascaded out of the windows. The crew on the deck stood in silence, hats off, as the wreckage was lowered and covered with tarps. But the real shock wasn't the physical wreckage. It was what the engineers found when they dried out the control panels and looked at the settings. The switches were the smoking gun. Once the salt water was cleaned off the instrument panel, the investigators realized that 3 specific switches had been flipped. Switches that could only be moved by a human hand after the explosion. 2 minutes and 45 seconds. This is the part of the story that NASA didn't want to talk about for a long time. It is the part that fuels the anger and the cover-up theories. When the cockpit was analyzed in the lab, investigators looked at the PEAPS, Personal Egress Air Packs. These are emergency air supplies, basically scuba tanks for astronauts. They are located on the back of the seats. To activate them, you have to reach behind your head or have someone else do it for you. 4 of the packs were recovered. 3 of them had been activated. Get this. Pilot Mike Smith's pack was turned on, but his pack was located behind his seat in a spot he couldn't reach while strapped in. That means either Ellison Onizuka or Judith Resnick, who were sitting behind him, reached forward and turned his air on. This changes everything. It proves, without a doubt, that for at least several seconds after the shuttle broke apart, the crew was alive, conscious, and working the problem. They weren't vaporized. They weren't unconscious. They were trying to save the ship and each other. The wild theories go into overdrive here. Some people claim there is a secret tape. NASA records all cabin audio. The official transcript ends at the moment of the breakup with pilot Mike Smith saying, "Uh-oh." But rumor has it that the recording continued. The secret tape theory suggests that there is audio of the crew talking during the descent, praying, or trying to fly the cabin. NASA officially denies this. They say the power was cut instantly when the ship broke apart, so the recorders stopped. But the conspiracy theorists ask, if the PEAPS were battery-operated or manual and the crew was alive, surely there was a backup power source for the comms? Let's look at the physics. The cabin separated at 46,000 feet. It continued up to 65,000. Then it fell. The fall took 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Try to imagine that. Sit there and watch a clock for nearly 3 minutes. If the cabin depressurized, the crew would have passed out from lack of oxygen within seconds. That would be a mercy, but the peeps were activated. If the cabin held its pressure, they would have been awake for the entire fall. They would have seen the sky turn from black to blue. They would have heard the roar of the wind increasing as they accelerated. They would have felt the sickening drop of weightlessness followed by the crushing G-forces of the spin. The disturbing signature found by the divers wasn't just the metal, it was the forensic proof of this nightmare. The switches showed intent. The air packs showed survival instinct. There is another theory, darker than the rest, the ejection seat theory. The early shuttles had ejection seats, but they were removed to save weight and because they were deemed useless for a crew of 7. The theory goes that the commander Scobie tried to engage a stabilization system that didn't exist anymore. The tragedy is that they were flying a brick with no windows that could open and no way out. When the public found out about the activated air packs, years later after the report was leaked, it caused a firestorm. People felt lied to. NASA had allowed the instant death narrative to stand because it was less painful for the families and less damaging to the program. Admitting that they fell to their deaths while trying to fix the ship made the negligence of the O-ring decision feel like murder. The investigators also found that the pilot had moved several electrical switches on his right-hand panel. He was trying to restore power to the cockpit. He was fighting until the very last second. This forensic evidence turned the Challenger disaster into a story of ultimate heroism. They didn't just sit there. They didn't panic. They did their jobs. Even as the sky was falling, they were astronauts. But the wild side of the internet didn't stop there. Some claim the crew was still alive after impact and drowned. This is false. The impact at 200 miles per hour created a force of 200 Gs. It was instantly fatal. The structure found by the divers was crushed in a way that made survival impossible. However, the what if remains. What if the parachutes that were designed for the solid rocket boosters had been attached to the cabin? Could they have floated down? Engineers crunched the numbers later. It was technically possible to design a breakaway cabin with chutes, but it was too heavy, too expensive, and NASA thought the shuttle was safe enough not to need it. That arrogance is what eliminated them. The recovery was done and the cause was found, but the strange events surrounding the Challenger didn't stop with the burial. In fact, the weirdest theories were just getting started. Iceberg. Even decades later, the Challenger disaster is surrounded by a cloud of wild theories. When something this traumatic happens, the human brain doesn't want to accept a simple answer like, "It was cold." We want a villain. We want a complex plot. Let's look at the KGB sabotage theory again. In the mid-80s, the US and USSR were racing to build space weapons. The Star Wars program, SDY, relied on the shuttle to lift heavy laser satellites. If the shuttle program failed, SDY failed. Some intelligence analysts and a lot of fiction writers speculated that the Soviets used a directed energy weapon to heat the tank, or that a sleeper agent at the launch pad tampered with the strut. Is there proof? No. But the presence of those Russian trawlers and the Phantom Flash keeps the theory alive in dark corners of the web. Then there is the fake death theory. This one is truly out there. It claims that the astronauts were taken off the shuttle before launch and are still alive, living under new identities. Internet sleuths claim to have found people who look exactly like the crew, with the same names, working as professors or accountants. It's a classic Elvis is alive style conspiracy. It's disrespectful and debunked, but it gets millions of views because people love a mystery. Another wild one? The UFO intervention. Some blurry frames of the launch footage show a small white dot zooming past the shuttle just before the explosion. UFO enthusiasts claim it was an extraterrestrial craft that either attacked the shuttle or tried to help it. In reality, it was likely a bird or a piece of ice, but try telling that to the internet. But let's bring it back to reality, which is actually scarier than the aliens. The real conspiracy wasn't the Russians or the aliens. It was the bureaucracy. It was a room full of men in suits looking at a chart that said, "Death is probable if you launch," and launching anyway because they didn't want to look bad on TV. The disturbing signature the divers found was the result of a meeting where safety was voted down. The divers who touched that wreckage know the truth. They saw the reality of physics and biology. They didn't see laser burns or alien marks. They saw a machine that failed because of hubris. The legacy of that dive is still with us. The pieces of Challenger are buried in a decommissioned missile silo at Cape Canaveral, sealed in concrete. NASA literally buried the evidence, not to hide it, but to honor it. They treat it like a tomb. Every now and then, a piece of debris washes up on a Florida beach, a ghostly reminder from 1986. And those divers? They changed the way we search the ocean. The technology used to find the Challenger, side-scan sonar, deep-rated ROVs, was refined during that mission. It paved the way for finding the Titanic and the search for MH370. The signature they found on the screen that day was a warning. It told us that the ocean is deep, space is hard, and we are fragile. The wild theories are just our way of trying to make sense of the senseless. But the truth found in the silt is that 7 brave people fought for their lives while falling from the stars, and we owe it to them to remember the reality, not just the rumors. Does that make the Challenger disaster a story of failure or a story of ultimate courage? And what do you make of the Soviet spy ship reports? Do you think we got the full story? Let me know in the comments. If you want more deep dives into history's darkest secrets, smash that like button and subscribe. See you in the next one.